Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting the fifth topic of the semester titled China, Three Ways of Thought. All right, so this is session one, and we're going to provide an overview, an introduction of this topic. We're going to be looking at the table of contents, how we're going to approach this topic, what are going to be the main parts, and we're going to look at also some general ideas, general introduction, looking at the geography of China, of this civilization, and then we're going to be moving into the actual lecture, and that we'll be looking at the formative stage of China civilization. So let's go to our slide. Once again, this is another river civilization we're going to be examining. It goes back in time to the time of the great river civilizations that we have been looking at in the past, like, for example, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India. It is also one of those civilizations that flourished almost at the same time. And we're going to be looking at particularly Chinese history since the very early formative years all the way to, let us just say, the 1300s AD. Again, so it's going to be a grand survey, so to speak, which are going to explain the major stages of development of this very ancient civilization. So, as the table of contents show, we're first going to look at a general introduction. We're going to explain, for example, the title. What do we mean, for example, the three ways of thought? We're going to explain that, and we're also going to explain that China is one of the ancient civilizations and a millenarian civilization. We're going to get to explain that before we move into the actual stages of development. For example, part one is going to look at the formative era of Chinese history. The very first formation of, let us just say, the cultures and city life, for example, going back to 3000 BC. We're going to be looking at that, all the way to 221 BC. Again, this is going to be the formation of ancient Chinese civilization. Part two is going to look at the sort of classical expression of Chinese civilization that produce perhaps the three most important philosophical schools of thought. Although there were so many in ancient China, three are going to dominate. We're going to get to see, for example, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Again, those are going to be really the main schools of thought that will be driving Chinese history. They will serve as the philosophical support for the Chinese state, for example. Chinese society is also going to adopt many of those views, and this is going to be the kind of worldview, so to speak, that China will be guided by. Very different from India. We looked at India, how metaphysics, mysticism, spirituality were the guiding principles, searching for divine reality. But here is more about philosophy in China. Again, philosophy is going to be providing pretty much the groundwork for how people should live their lives, how people should behave with one another, and what is really the ultimate purpose of human existence. Again, we're going to be covering that very extensively in part two. Then, at some point, China will consolidate. The different kingdoms of China are going to be unified through conquest in this case, and we're going to see the formation of a Chinese empire. And in particular, there were one dynasty, in this case, that actually achieved the unification of China through conquest. It was the Qin dynasty, we're going to get to see the emperor of this dynasty that unified all the different kingdoms, conquered them, and created an imperial order, an imperial system. We're going to get to see very closely. And of course, after the Qing dynasty, we're going to see another dynasty, the Han dynasty, that continued with this imperial system and expanded that system even further. So again, this is now the time for imperial history in China. Again, this is the history of empires, so to speak. It started with the Qing dynasty. It continued with the Han dynasties. We're going to get to see very closely this development. And the very last part is going to look at the three heirs of the Han Empire. This empire will continue. China is not going to cease to be an empire, at least for the time period that we're going to be looking at. China will continue pretty much expanding as an empire, and we're going to see two more dynasties that will continue with this process of imperial rule. For example, the Tang and the Song dynasties. Again, we're going to be looking at very closely what kind of institutions, what kind of philosophical, religious ideas they implemented in order to provide cohesion to the empire, how they attempted to expand the empire, and what kind of challenges also they faced, particularly from without, the nomads and the so-called barbarians. And that is precisely the third heir of the Han Empire that we're going to be looking at very closely, and that is the Turkish Empire. Again, it's a group of nomads / barbarians that are going to emerge in Central Asia as a very dominant force, and they're going to create an empire that will pose significant challenges to the Chinese Empire. Again, so those are the four main parts that we're going to be assessing in this topic. We will cover this topic, just like all the others, in 3 separate sessions. Hopefully, we get to cover in this session the general introduction, looking at the geography as well, and then, of course, looking at part 1. Hopefully, we can actually accomplish all of that so we can save space in the second session to look at part 2. All right, so as a general introduction, we're going to look at China. This is another millenarian civilization, just like India, for example. India is really a millenarian civilization as well. The only difference is that China, unlike India, and really unlike any other civilization in the world, is a civilization that has maintained the longest historical continuity of all. Again, this is the oldest civilization in existence, that is to say. All right. So India, for example, it is also considered a millenarian civilization, but there have been significant ruptures taking place in the past. We examined that in the previous topic. For example, the collapse of the Indus River Valley civilization around 1500 BC, the arrival of the Aryans and so on, and they introduced novel ideas into India and the like. Of course, there's been significant changes, disruptions, collapses, and the like in Indian history. But here in China, again, this civilization really goes back continuously for about 5,000 years. We're looking about more or less, give and take, 3000 BC. This is really the early stages, the early formation of Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, 3000 BC. And that culture and that civilization has just been expanding and expanding continuously, incorporating, of course, novel ideas about philosophy, like we mentioned, Confucianism, Taoism, and so on, and acquiring its unique classical characteristics along the way. But all of those central characteristics have been maintained over 5,000 years or so. Again, it's really a very conservative society, a very conservative culture that looks to the past as the model for how civilization should move forward, in other words. So it looks at the past for inspiration. And so it tries to retain its unique identity, its unique formations, expressions, in terms of, for example, political systems, like the political dynasties, for example. The story of China civilization can be summed up as the story of the different political dynasties that have ruled China. Almost unbroken. Of course, one dynasty sometimes, collapses, but another quickly replaces it and continues ruling Chinese civilization and driving civilization forward. Okay, so we see that continuity again in the kind of political order, the political structure again has been maintained over thousands of years. The religious and philosophical ideas as well have been maintained, like ideas about ancestor worship, for example. Taoism and so on. We're going to be talking about that very closely in this session. All of those ideas have been maintained over thousands of years. The economic systems, particularly the agricultural systems, for example, the life of agriculture, the peasantry, has always been central to Chinese society, to Chinese culture as well. It has been maintained over thousands of years. And also the social organization. How Chinese society is organized has also been maintained over thousands of years, even to this very present day. It has remained at the very fundamental level a society based on kinship. That is to say that people in China see themselves as an extended family, that is to say. Okay, so they really organize themselves around that principle of the extended family group, okay, from the smallest village to the nation as a whole. Chinese society see itself connected in familial connections and connected to common ancestors in the past as well. So again, those are central themes that have been maintained over large periods of time. We can say that many of those themes continue very much alive and present up to this very present day. Perhaps there has been some alterations in the 20th century as a result of revolutions and modernity, industrialization, indeed. But for the time that we're examining in this course that looks at Chinese civilization up to 1500 AD, again, those central themes pretty much remain not necessarily intact, but very, very constant, with some change along the way. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, another very important aspect of Chinese civilization that I just mentioned a few moments ago are the philosophical schools of thought that came to dominate the Chinese state, at least the principles by which the state legitimizes itself, for example, and also the philosophical principles that guided people's lives at the grassroots level, again, at the most popular level, if you will, the level of the peasantry, for example. Those are principles that emerged in the years, or let us just say centuries, before the birth of Christ. About 4 or 5 centuries before the birth of Christ, we're going to see the flourishing of a number of different philosophical trends in China, but 3 are going to dominate, and they're going to become the most popular, the most accepted, the most ingrained ideas in Chinese culture: Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. And those are precisely the kinds of themes that will persist across centuries and all the way to the 1500s, even beyond. Again, so just keep that in mind. This is the subtitle of this topic, China, 3 Ways of Thought. And the reason for that is because, as we'll see, those are going to become central to how people organize the state and how they try to provide meaning to human existence, and also how people find orientation again in the world at large. Now, another very significant aspect of Chinese civilization and Chinese history is that, unlike India, here China, it's a civilization that for the most part has been driven by the state, by the actions, by the laws, by the goals established by the different political dynasties, by the different royal dynasties that have ruled China. They are the ones that are pushing history forward in terms of innovating new technologies, trying to sponsor public works, trying to expand the territorial domain of China, trying to create a common identity, trying to provide cohesion to society. It is the state that is really crafting and shaping the civilization across thousands of years. Again, the dynasties. So it is really, again, something that we're going to be examining very closely in this topic, is that as we move along the timeline, you'll notice that we're going to be examining the different dynasties that rule China at different points in time, and we're going to be paying a close attention to how they were molding society, what actions they were taking, what kind of institutions they formed, what kind of laws they created in order to provide, once again, an identity for the general people, but also cohesion as well to the kingdom or to the empire. Again, all right. So this is very different. Let us just say from India. We know when we examine, for example, Indian history, local institutions were the ones actually providing identity and cohesion to people in India, not the state. The states, again, were very fragmented. They were rather small. In reality, it was religion, things like, for example, Hinduism, the caste system, guilds, and so on. Those local institutions serve people a basis for group identity and also for cohesion as well. Again, so it's very different, India and China in that regard. All right, so before we look into part one, looking at the formative era of Chinese civilization, it is extremely important to look at the geography of China. The geography really explains the kind of cultural ideas and cultural characteristics that the peoples of China will be crafting across millennia. In many cases, human cultures are expressions of the environment in which they arise. Okay, this is something that we have been looking at in previous topics, whether we're looking at Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India. The geography is like the stage by which people are going to create, if you will, a kind of theatrical play, so to speak. And it all depends on what kind of stage is available. In other words, what kind of environment, what kind of climate, what kind of soil, that people are going to be able to craft a certain story, a certain set of themes based on their experience with the natural environment. So let's look at China's geography so we can gain some insights as to what kind of culture came out of this kind of environment. All right, so first and foremost, the very first geographical feature that is going to shape Chinese history and culture are the two major rivers that are going to serve as the basis for the agricultural base that will feed all of the Chinese settlements and cities that will form ancient China. Again, we're talking about the Yellow River and the Yangtze rivers. Again, those are the two main rivers that are going to be the lifeblood, so to speak, of Chinese culture and society. Okay, the two major rivers, as you can see here. The Yellow River is just to the north, and the Yangtze River is in the very, very south. And as we'll see, Chinese civilization started out in the north, actually in the Yellow River. Now, those rivers, let me just try to show the map so you can see here. They flow from west to east. They start in the western mountains of Central Asia. They're fed by the seasonal rains and so on. And they're going to provide abundant water to those two rivers. And the water is going to empty out, if you will, in the China Sea, in the Pacific Ocean. Now, unlike the Nile of Egypt, the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers are not going to be very, let us just say, manageable or predictable. Quite the contrary. Those two rivers are going to, in many cases, be very violent and also very unpredictable as well. Okay, they're going to bring just a lot of water from time to time, and in many instances, those resulted in floodings that devastated populations, just like in ancient Mesopotamia as well, with the two rivers that we examined in the past. Okay, so it's a similar story in that regard. The rivers are considered violent, particularly the North River. The Yellow River is even more violent than the Yangtze River of the south. Okay, they tend to overflow, and there's violent floodings that result in thousands and thousands of deaths from time to time. So this is perhaps one of the very first experiences with the environment by the ancient Chinese people, again, that they depend on those two rivers for farming, for sustenance, but at the same time, being so close to them also entailed danger, entailed death and catastrophe from time to time. As I mentioned, the Yellow River to the north was more prone to violent floods. As a matter of fact, this river has been labeled in China as China's sorrow, just because people remember the many times in Chinese history when that river ended up decimating populations, towns, communities, settlements. Even in the 20th century, there were millions of people that were killed by the floodings of this river. Just again, in the 20th century, millions of people died. Again, so it continues with this pattern, again, of violent floods. The Yangtze River to the south, although is also prone to violent floods, it seems to be a little bit more manageable and is more useful for navigation. Okay, in that regard, it's not that there are no floodings or anything like that, but rather that it is more navigation friendly, let us just say. So there's more people traveling around that river back and forth, which allows for trade and communication. So it's more manageable in that regard. Okay, so number two, another very critical feature of China's geography is what is called the north-south geographical split. In other words, that when you look at China's geography, there are two very distinct geographical regions, one to the north and also very different to the south as well. Okay, so it's not a uniform climate or terrain or soil. There are significant differences depending on where you are. North and south, again, are going to mark very, very sharp distinctions. in the environment, and they are going to be expressed also in the cultures that will arise in China as well. Okay, so for example, the north tends to be more cold, more dry, and is composed of flat plains as well. And in the north, we're going to see people domesticating certain wild plants that will serve as the basis for their food culture, and that is millet and wheat. Okay, millet and wheat. So this is where we're going to see, for example, the emergence of noodles and dumplings, for example, that are very characteristics of Chinese cuisine in the northern region. In the south, we have a more subtropical climate. Is hot, humid, is wet as well. It's composed of hills. It's not really a flat plain in this case. So this kind of climate is going to be more suitable for the cultivation of rice. So it is in South China where we're gonna see again the domestication of rice, and this is going to be the dominant food item in the culture of the South. Again, rice dishes of all kinds. All right, so there are significant cultural differences. This is not a uniform culture, and that is because there is a geographical, of course, distinction as well. Okay, so number 3, another very important geographical feature of China that is going to shape Chinese history, culture, and society is the fact that in this very specific region that we're looking at, for example, when you look at the Yangtze River, the Yellow River, that section that comprises those two rivers and everything in between, was the core of Chinese civilization. Really, this is going to be the core of Chinese civilization. And when we examine the geography at large, we see that this core region is going to be protected by natural barriers. Just like Egypt was protected by a series of natural barriers, for example, the Saharan Desert, to the west, the Mediterranean Ocean to the north, the Red Sea as well to the east, and the mountains to the south, that allowed Egyptian civilization to really be protected from foreign invasions, and we see a long continuity as well in Egyptian civilization. Likewise, we see something similar taking place here in China. Again, this is a region that is protected by natural barriers on every side as well, and it will serve to protect China for a good while from foreign invasions, and will allow the Chinese again to craft their unique, and very distinct culture and civilization. Okay, for example, when you look at those natural barriers, we see, for instance, that to the north there is what is called the Gobi Desert. Okay, the Gobi Desert to the north serves as a barrier, so to speak. Not that those barriers cannot be crossed. This is not to say that people cannot cross, and invade China, because that's exactly what will happen eventually, in due course. But for thousands of years, China remained protected from all sides because it had those barriers, like the Gobi Desert to the north, the mountains of the Tibetan Plateau to the west, as you can see in this map. Again, so this is the core region where China is going to flourish, right here between the two rivers. We got the Gobi Desert here to the north, the Tibetan Plateau, the mountains here to the west. We got the China Sea to the east as well. So to the east is just the ocean. And to the south, there are very dense jungles, again, that are the jungles of Southeast Asia, right here to the west again. So it is really protected by barriers on all fronts that is going to make it very difficult for foreign invaders to simply just pour into China and invade it and take over. Of course, eventually that is going to happen, but it's going to happen much, much, much later, in the 1200s, around the 1200s AD. Again, so it happens so late, so to speak, in China's history. The invasion of the nomadic invasions from the north, the Mongols in this case. We're going to be examining that much, much later in the semester. It will be the last topic we're going to examine, the nomadic invasions, of the world. We're going to examine the Mongols in this regard. That will be one of the nomads that we're going to be looking at eventually. But this is extremely important because this is going to explain in many ways why China, on one hand, will be protected from foreign invasions, and what that actually did is that it allowed for China to be isolated from the rest of the world. It was developing its civilization in splendid isolation from the rest of the world, and it was doing so by not being influenced by any kind of foreign culture, in other words. Okay? So this is very important, that many of the characteristics of Chinese civilization came from within, in other words. This is not to say that from time to time, China borrowed a few elements from without, but those elements were borrowed as opposed to elements that were introduced by force by foreign invaders, in other words. So again, we're going to see why developing their distinct civilization in splendid isolation marked China's tendency to remain highly conservative, to try to retain its cultural ideas, the norms, the institutions, the ways of thought of the past, because they were not worried or that were not very much concerned with people invading their society and imposing a foreign culture onto them, in other words. Okay? So this really shaped this very marked cultural conservatism of Chinese civilization. It's a highly conservative society in that regard. And because they were able to conserve many of their institutions and norms and ideas and beliefs across millennia due to this geographical isolation, this in turn created among the Chinese a sense of exceptionalism, that they were an exceptional people, in other words. Okay? In fact, they considered their civilization as the true civilization. They were the civilized ones, whereas anybody that lived outside of their civilization were simply called barbarians. Okay? No matter how advanced those civilizations were, again, they were barbarians or backward, or maybe not so much backward or barbarians. Let's say the Egyptians or Mesopotamia, for example, that also created very sophisticated civilizations as well, but they consider them to be really on the fringes on the edges, if you will, of the world, that they were not all that important. Again, so there's a sense of exceptionalism among the Chinese, and they saw themselves as being situated, located in the very center of the world. As a matter of fact, in ancient China, people did not call themselves, Chinese, or that they lived in China, but rather they called themselves the Middle Kingdom. What that meant is that their kingdom was the kingdom that was placed in the very center of the world, and everything really revolved around it. They consider themselves as the main innovators of all the tools, all the ideas of agriculture, all the technologies, the writing system, philosophy, art, poetry, literature, medicine, that they were the ones that were actually coming up with all of those expressions, and everybody else was simply imitating them or borrowing ideas from them anyways. Okay, so again, this is again a product of the geography. Okay, how the geography is going to shape how a group of people are going to craft a culture that is going to remain very unique, very distinct, because it's isolated from everything else. It has very few foreign influences coming in, and for that reason, they're going to actually try to conserve their own culture as being, exceptional, and they're going to think of themselves as, living in the very center of the world, and everybody else, again, are labeled as barbarians, uncivilized, in other words. All right, so now that we have gained some understanding about the significance of this topic in terms of, again, looking at, China as a millenarian civilization that created three modes of thought, and how the state, the dynasties are going to be driving history, and also the significance of the geography for Chinese culture and society. Now let's look at part one, looking at the formative era of Chinese civilization. And the formative stage, if you will, of Chinese civilization spanned for thousands of years, roughly speaking from 3000 to 221 BC. Those can be seen as the formative years, the formative period of Chinese civilization. All right, so first and foremost, let's look at the early human origins of China. It is important to gain some insights as to, okay, so the first inhabitants of this region of the world, can we have some understanding of who were the human beings that actually populated this region? So according to paleoanthropologists and the archaeological record, what it shows is that the very first inhabitants of this region were the Homo erectus. We looked at that out of Africa in that first topic of the semester. The so-called Neanderthals, as they were called, that migrated out of Africa. We see evidence that Homo erectus lived in this region about 2 million years ago. However, about 60,000 BC, we see the arrival of Homo sapiens. They're also arriving from Africa, and it is not very clear whether the Homo sapiens displaced the Homo erectus and replaced them altogether, meaning that they waged war and eliminated the Homo erectus, or that there was perhaps some interbreeding between those two. It is still very unclear as to how that process unfolded. But this is as far as we know about the very early peoples of East Asia. Again, they during this time, 60,000 BC, were hunter-gatherer tribal groups. They were simply conducting hunting expeditions, gathering edible foods, and they lived in tribes. That is to say, those are actually kin groups, people that are related to one another in familial connections. They travel together, and in many cases they settled around bodies of water, they fish, they hunt, and this is how they sustain themselves. And that kind of livelihood remained for tens of thousands of years until the arrival of the Neolithic period. It is when in the Neolithic period where we're going to see a transformation taking place. This is the beginning of early farming practices. Again, this is a process that started, roughly speaking, about 7000 BC People in East Asia, in this region of the world, they're flocking to the Yellow River, and they're trying to create the very first villages and communities and trying to grow some wild plants like millet, for example, and wheat. Again, this is the north part of that region. They're also relying on other survival strategies like herding, for example. They're herding animals, they're domesticating, in this case, cattle. The water buffalo, for example, is being domesticated during this time. And we see the emergence of sedentary societies for the very first time in this region. Again, they're also based on kinship. Again, this is a tribal form of organization. People are related to one another, in terms of being born into the group or being married into the group. Again, they see themselves as this extended family society. This is very important, and keep that in mind, because that form of social organization is going to remain constant across thousands of years. It's called kinship, again, in China. Okay, kinship. We see the very beginning of artwork, pottery. There's evidence, again, of artwork. People are using clay, for example, stones, and they're crafting different kinds of figurines for religious purposes in many cases. And by 4000 BC, we see the beginning of metallurgy as well. The beginning of the Bronze Age. People are beginning to work with bronze, and they're crafting tools. They're crafting artwork made from bronze around 4000 BC. So we can see a rapid transformation taking place during the Neolithic period. And as far as the religious worldview, during this time, the Neolithic period, we see the emergence of a worldview that it's very ancestral. Again, this is the most ancestral religious worldview in humanity. It's called animism. We see evidence that the Neolithic peoples of this region continue with this animistic religious worldview, in which, again, the world is seen as populated, inhabited by spirits. In this case, they are worshiping fertility spirits, the spirits of fertility, fertilizing the land, fertilizing the soil, fertilizing the water, and so on, of the rivers, and so on. But also, worshiping of ancestor spirits is important during this time. Okay, people believe that when a person dies, the soul of the departed individual remains in the land in many cases. Okay, it remains in the landscape, and it's important to maintain communication with those spirits, because those spirits ultimately help and guide the living members of the family. So we see very early on the very early formation of an ancestor worship in ancient China. And ancestor worship remains alive all the way to the very present day in China. It's one of the most popular, one of the most important religious cults practiced in China. We see other kinds of religious practices, burial practices during this time are carried out through ceremonies. Again, there are shamans, or there are religious guides or spiritual guides that oversee the ceremony, guiding the soul, of the departed one into the afterlife. Because remember, it's very important to feed the spirits of the dead, to remain in constant communication with them. So we see those kinds of practices here. And what we also see is evidence of ritual sacrifice as well, meaning that when a person died, in many cases that person was buried with a servant, it was buried with another family member, and so on, a relative of some kind. And the idea is that that person was to accompany the deceased person into the afterlife. So they conducted a ritual sacrifice. After a person will die, then the person that wanted to accompany into the afterlife, the deceased one, will be sacrificed as well. So there's evidence that there's really human sacrifice taking place. So human sacrifice is a very strong component of Chinese religion going back to the Neolithic period, and it will remain so, as we'll see, even in subsequent times as well, even when China entered the phase of civilization. Ritual sacrifice remained at some point still relevant. Now, by 3000 BC, we're going to see the emergence of now a more distinct kind of culture. This is going to be now the very first seed of Chinese civilization, so to speak. It all started around 3000 BC with a culture that is called the Longshan culture. The Longshan's culture. Again, from 3000 to 2000 BC. This is when we see the formation of cities that were protected by walls. Again, those are walled cities. So remember, civilization, it means life in the city. That's what civilization means. So this is the emergence of cities very, very early on in ancient China that correspond with the emergence of cities in the Nile, in ancient Egypt, in Mesopotamia as well, the Indus River Valley as well. It corresponds to the same time period. During this time, we see the emergence of a Proto-Chinese script as well. The very early writing system. It was a system composed of different symbols that depicted ideas, that depicted places, and so on, of nature, and so on. And as we'll see, this Proto-Chinese script is going to later on be used as the basis of the writing system of ancient China. Again, so we see the very early formation of a writing script. We see advanced bronze and black pottery, and that again is becoming more and more complex, more and more sophisticated, the use of bronze. And this is really going to give rise to the very first dynasties that are going to be driving Chinese society and Chinese history forward. This culture that we just discussed is going to give rise to the very first royal dynasty that in Chinese history people remember as the forerunner of all the royal dynasties of ancient China. And it spanned for about 350 years, from 2000 to 1750 BC. Now, it is very, very important to note that this dynasty, called the Xia dynasty, in many cases is so much wrapped up in myth that is very difficult to distinguish the historical side from the mythical side. Some scholars tend to believe that this Xia dynasty, this time that Chinese historians refer to, is more of a mythical construction than anything else. In other words, and it serves as a myth to provide a sort of grand beginning for Chinese civilization. So the problem is that there's not a lot of archaeological evidence to support many of the assumptions, many of the claims of the Chinese historians about this time. So it is the lack of archaeological record that puts, in many cases, the story of the Xia dynasty in question. And presumably, the region where the Xia dynasty actually started building their kingdom, it is in this region that you see in this map. Again, this area of red. This is, again, in the Yellow River in the north. This is the very first region where supposedly the very first kingdom of China emerged. Okay, the very first kingdom ruled by a royal dynasty, the Xia dynasty. Once again, there's a lack of archaeological evidence, and in many cases, historians from many areas of the world tend to conclude that this is more of a mythological construct that the Chinese crafted, particularly later Chinese dynasties. We're going to be looking at those dynasties in just a few moments. Some of those dynasties actually crafted those myths in order to provide some form of grand meaning to the existence of their own kingdoms and to legitimize their own rule. That their dynasties, their kingdoms went back to a golden time. It was a golden era when we see, mythical figures, gods, for example, and celestial emperors creating Chinese civilization, in a very miraculous way. Okay, so let's look at those mythical origins of China, of the Xia dynasty. There is a very important creation myth, in China that tells the story about how the world was created. And this is all going to lead up to the Xia dynasty. And they said, well, the world was created by the very first man. It was like a cosmic being, very similar to what we saw in India, the story of the creation of the caste system by the cosmic being, Purusha, that sacrificed his body to create the four castes again in the beginning of time. We see something similar here, but also very different in so many ways, in that there was a cosmic being called, Panku. Panku was the very first man. He was a cosmic being that created the world about 2 million. We're talking about 2,229,000 years BC. This is when the world was created by Panku, and after a while, he ruled the earth for about 18,000 years. And after 18,000 years, he sacrificed his body to give form and to give shape to the earth. Okay? So from his breath, the wind and the clouds were created, they said. From his own voice came the thunder. From his veins, the rivers were created. Okay, from his veins, the rivers were created. From his flesh, the earth was created and the soil. From his hair, the grass and the trees were created. From his bones, all the metals of the world were created. And from his sweat, the rain was created as well. That was his sweat. Now, and this is very interesting, the lice and the insects that crawl on his body, they were the very first human beings, again, in the world. So human beings are considered like lice, again, compared to this being, that created the world. And maybe it is, again, a way to say that maybe human beings are insignificant compared, again, to the cosmos, compared to the universe, compared to the creator of the world, for example, and that human beings started out as animals, eating the flesh of other animals, and that we were, human beings were rude and barbaric, and were just like any other creature, any other animal in the world. Okay, that is again the story of creation. Now, it is precisely, in this story that the Chinese are going to now create the culture hero mythology. In other words, who actually civilize human beings. Okay? Remember that the Chinese see themselves as the true civilization. This is where civilization started, period, in the world. So they're going to actually explain how that happened, and it happened during the Xia dynasty, once again, according to them. And this is going to explain also the origins of kingship as well, the first kings. Because really the culture heroes that were the first civilizers of China and the first civilizers of humanity were actually monarchs. They were emperors. And it all started with a very inept, inefficient ruler. King Kun was his name. He was actually told by people, in this region to protect them, that they were, entrusting unto him his skills to lead and to protect them from the river, from the floodings. So apparently he was given that mission that, look, do something, try to control the river. We're trying to create agriculture and farming, but we cannot because the river is killing us constantly from time to time. So he was very inept, and eventually he was driven out of power. And it is precisely when he was driven out of power that we're going to see instead the arrival of 5 celestial kings from this dynasty, the Xia dynasty. Again, they are sages, they are very wise, they're enlightened, and they're coming from the sky in order to rule the earth and actually create civilization. The first one was King Yu, and he's really the king that was the person who created the first canals and irrigation systems. He's considered to be the father of irrigation. He conquered the floods of the Yellow River. Again, the victory over the floods. Again, he's the first to start building, again, the canals, diverting the water, and try to protect people from the river. And this is going to be the justification for government. In other words, that the purpose, the function of a monarch, the function of a king is to protect people, but most importantly is to create works of engineering in order to divert water from the river in order to begin this process of agriculture, okay? And expand those projects as well. That this is the main function, again, of the state. Perhaps this is really, again, a nice story that kind of explains, why kings are needed in the world. Again, kings are needed, well, because they are the ones actually creating the public works, the engineering projects in order to control the river and manage the water, in other words. Okay. Another celestial emperor of the Xia dynasty was Sheng Nong, and he's the one who taught humans how to farm. He was a divine farmer, and he taught them everything about farming. He gave them all the tools for farming, how to domesticate wild plants, how to collect seeds, and how to engage in all the work across the seasons and the harvesting and so on. He's really the master farmer, in other words. Okay, so once again, the beginning of Chinese civilization also has an agricultural origin as well. That this is where our civilization began. It began with agriculture, again, by the celestial sage. Fuxi as well, he's the one that introduced knowledge about hunting and fishing as well. Again, so everything that people needed to know for hunting and fishing, he is the master of hunting and fishing, and he's going to be remembered and worshipped, for that as well. Yao was the sage king that crafted the very first calendars, mapping the cycles of time, the rhythms of nature, the cycles of the moon and the sun, crafting the first calendars as well, in order to guide people in the agricultural year, in other words. Last but not least, Huan Di, he was the master of invention. He is the first person to devise the writing system, ceramics, and he's the first one to taught people how to craft silks as well. So he was the master of all kinds of inventions. Okay, so the significance of those myths, the moral of those legends, is that monarchs in Chinese culture and society are considered to be the innovators. They're the people that are actually crafting the new technologies, the new tools that enable people to survive better in the environment, controlling the rivers, knowledge about farming, agriculture, for example, crafting calendars, hunting, fishing, and all kinds of inventions, again, from writing. And from writing will come poetry, it will come literature, it will come philosophy, trade, you name it. Again, that this is the function of the monarch. The monarch is there to sponsor and to foster technological knowledge and innovation. And also that the monarchs, or those dynasties for that matter, started with the Xia dynasty, are the ones that are civilizing human beings. They're turning the lice and the insects, again, that we talked about, the barbarians, the animals, of human beings, and turning those barbarians into human beings. That is their purpose. That is their mission, in other words. So this is why I mentioned in the very beginning of this session why the dynasties are going to be driving Chinese history forward in this regard. Because from the Xia dynasty, we're going to see all subsequent dynasties trying to also innovate new technologies, new philosophies, trying to innovate new institutions, whether political, economic institutions, in order to continue this process of civilization. In other words, that this is how the Chinese dynasties, the monarchs, see themselves, again, in that regard, playing this very central role in human affairs, in other words. Okay? All right. So, once again, the Xia dynasty has some historical, perhaps, elements, but has a very strong mythological component to it. However, the next dynasty we're going to look at, the Shang dynasty, that spanned from 1750 to 1027 BC. This dynasty can be considered as a historical dynasty. There's plenty of historical records and evidence that there was, of course, a dynasty that ruled China, or the Middle Kingdom, as it was called, and we have more factual evidence, again, of their works. And they're going to expand the original Xia kingdom, and they're going to expand across the two rivers. Again, the Yellow and the Yangtze River will be now expanded, and that is going to be the region controlled, dominated by the Shang dynasty. Okay, so let's look at the origins and political organization. Now, and this is very important, how nomadic groups are going to play a key role in the development of Chinese history. This is evident by the fact that the Shang dynasty started out as a group of nomads. Those are actually people that have domesticated, for example, the horse, and they were also herding animals as well, moving animals from place to place. They are going to come in and take over the Xia kingdom, and they're going to now install their group, the Shangs, again, as the new ruling dynasty. Again, the conqueror was considered to be a warrior. Again, this is a society of nomads and warriors. Tang was his name, and he's going to conquer the last Xia ruler, overthrow him, and by doing so, he now installed himself as the new monarch, again, of the Middle Kingdom, again, as it was called. Now, the Shang dynasty is going to rule China in a quite different way. We have a more centralized system of government in which all power was concentrated in the monarch. Again, this is called absolutism. In other words, the ruler, the Shang ruler, the monarch, that is to say, he was in total control of the state. He was in total control of the kingdom, and all power was centralized in himself. Okay, and he's going to have a bureaucracy below him made up of warriors. It's a warrior aristocracy. Remember, this is a group of people that conquered this region, and as such, the generals, so to speak, that were second in command to the conqueror are going to receive lands, in other words. So what Shang is going to do, the Shang ruler, is going to actually divide the kingdom into different regions and award lands to the different warriors or generals that aided the conquest, and they're going to remain as the landlords, so to speak, of those provinces. And they are totally loyal, of course, and totally obedient to the monarch. Again, the monarch is not really sharing any power. Remember, this is a very centralized, highly centralized system, and what the king says is law, and all the other aristocrats that are scattered across the kingdom must obey the dictates of the monarch. Okay, and this warrior aristocracy are pretty much carrying out all the functions of the state. They serve as ambassadors. They're the administrators of the provinces. They collect tribute that is to be paid to the monarch. So this is, again, a warrior clan, so to speak, that has taken over the Middle Kingdom, and is going to rule it for many, many, many centuries. Now, because this is a warlike society, again, at least the dynasty is, the Shang dynasty, they're going to be very committed to expand the borders, the frontiers of the kingdom in many directions. They're going to be engaging in military campaigns in order to plunder neighboring villages, neighboring communities for treasure, for crops. They're fighting the so-called barbarians. Remember, they see all outsiders, people that live outside of their kingdom, as barbarians. So they're fighting them in many cases to not only plunder them, but also to take people captive in order to turn them into slaves. So we see during the Shang era, the Shang dynasty, the rise of slavery. And that came as a result of those wars of expansionism. Again, and so we see slowly but surely over the course of time the expansion of the borders of the Middle Kingdom. So it's, again, the kingdom is actually growing over time. We also see the development of a religious worldview, religious worldview that is going to be a little bit more expanded, more sophisticated than the religious worldview of the past that we mentioned, the animism, for example, that we mentioned, and so on. It's going to become a little bit more sophisticated. For example, we're going to see the introduction of a supreme divine being, Shang Di, or Di as he was called. He was considered, for example, the sky god. Okay, he is the supreme divine being. Remember that all nomadic groups in the ancient world followed the sky for orientation. And in many cases, their main supreme chief deity was the sky god. So here we see something similar. Shang Di is the supreme divine being that is the supreme lord of the kingdom, is the supreme lord of the dynasty as well. So much so that the king, in this case, claims to be the direct representative of Shang Di. Okay? So what we see here is also the emergence of what is called divine kinship. Okay? That the king is not just an ordinary human being, but rather he is a divine being. He is chosen by Shang Di in order to rule the earth. And he's ruling the earth in the very center of the universe. Again, so this is when the myth of the center of the world will become even more relevant. This is the time when ancient Chinese civilization is given its name as the Middle Kingdom, being in the middle of the sky, being in the middle of the earth, surrounded by the four seas. There were so many different names, but they all convey the same idea, that they are standing in the very center of everything. In other words, in the very center of creation. That is to say, okay? Because it's an agricultural society, they continue with the fertility rituals. They conduct dances and ceremonies. In many cases, the person conducting the dances and the ceremonies of fertility, at the very end, is burned alive. Okay, is burned alive to the fertility goddess. Again, so there is also this element of human sacrifice. Human sacrifice is not only taking place within the dances for fertility, but they're also taking place as in the past when a person died. Again, rulers, particularly when they died, when the monarch died, in many cases, the servants and the very close officials that served that monarch across his life are going to be sacrificed. There's a ritual that is performed, and they're going to be buried together, because the idea is that they're to accompany the ruler into the afterlife, to continue serving this divine being in the other world. Okay, so there is a very strong component of human sacrifice during the Shang dynasty. Also, one of the main preoccupations of the Shang dynasty is divination and fortune telling as well. The idea of trying to foretell the future, particularly when we're talking about, for example, harvest, the success of agricultural production. Because from time to time, of course, people in the ancient world suffer from calamities, from floods, for example, droughts and the like. So this is a civilization that is very, very concerned also with the success of agriculture, because agriculture forms the basis of their entire society. This is a river civilization, just like the other river civilizations that we have examined. So they're going to be very, very, very anxious to know what the future has stored for them. Are we going to have good crops? Are we going to be successful? Will there be a plague, for example? Will there be a flood? And so on. All of those issues are going to be very central to them. And this is going to be one of the main preoccupations of this society. All over that region, this is what people are inquiring. And of course, there's so many ways that they're trying to come up with answers for the future. In Mesopotamia, for example, the idea was to look at the sky and try to create calendars that can actually provide clues for, let's say, eclipses, lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, that can affect weather patterns, climatic changes, and so on, so you can foretell the future. But here, the idea is that people are trying to consult the spirits. They're trying to ask the ancestor spirits, more specifically, as to what is really, again, going to happen in the future. Okay? So this is one of the main preoccupations of the peoples, again, of the Shang dynasty, trying to ask the ancestors through different kinds of rituals. I will explain those rituals in just a few seconds, but it is here that it's important to connect, again, divination and fortune telling, and trying to ask the ancestor spirits with precisely with the development of an ancestor cult. Remember, this is a kinship-based society. All over this region, people lived in kin groups. People live, whether you're living in a small nested community, not a small village, a little town, and so on, doesn't matter. People see themselves connected in familial connections. And there's a very strong belief that family members that pass away must be nourished. You must maintain a link, a communication with those ancestors, because they provide very valuable aid, They foretell the future for you. They can provide good health. They can protect your crops and the like. So it's important to pay homage and conduct the proper rituals, particularly honoring the male ancestors. So it's very important. This is a male-dominated society, and it is really the male that is being honored in this regard. Okay, it is really the head of the household in the community. The king is male as well. So therefore, the males that pass away must be honored and must be remembered as well. Okay, so it is precisely that people are trying to consult the ancestors in order to foretell the future, in order to try to prepare themselves for any event, any catastrophic event that might happen. And in order to do this, during the Shang Dynasty, people used the writing system, actually developed a writing system precisely to use it for divination purposes. Again, so it is really the need to foretell the future that is going to lead to the development of a writing system. Well, you can communicate with the ancestors in so many ways, but one way is to write to them, with using symbols or signs, and in order to receive answers. So this led to the development of a writing system that is going to be used for divination purposes. It was a system, once again, that was taken from the Proto-Chinese script that we mentioned in the past. And it's going to be augmented. There's going to be more symbols that are going to denote concepts, ideas, or places, and the like. And they're going to be inscribed in bones. Again, so during the Shang Dynasty, people actually wrote a certain message on a piece of bone, inscribe the message. Let's just say they ask a question to the ancestor, and by asking that question on that bone, they expected an answer. And the way that they received, quote unquote, the answer was by throwing that bone with the written message on a fire. And after a while, there will be a priest that will come in and will try to read the message by the changes that occurred within the bone, and he will try to actually decipher the kind of symbols that were inscribed by the ashes or by the smoke on the bone as the answers of the ancestors. That the ancestors were actually answering those questions by changing the patterns of the bones and telling people what was to come in the future, particularly things about health and agriculture and the like. Again, so those are typical bones that have been found in China during the Shang Dynasty. Again, that actually tells us again that this was a common practice, but this is also leading to the development of a writing system as well. Again, the Chinese are very quickly developing a writing system. So during the Shang Dynasty, we see also the development of a bronze tool technology is becoming far more sophisticated, and the bronze that is being crafted during this time is being used by the elite, in this case by the monarchy, by the royal family, by the warrior aristocracy, for example, and they are used not only for status, but also for legitimacy as well, to provide legitimacy. That the legitimacy of the rulers, again, comes also from their artifacts, that the more sophisticated, the more crafty the artifact is, the more elaborate it is, that meant that they were in control of knowledge, that they were innovating. In other words, they were pushing innovation and technology forward, and they legitimized themselves by, again, commissioning people and artisans actually to work on bronze. And artisans enjoyed significant privileges. The metal workers, in this case, they had a lot of privileges. They constituted a segment of the elite, so to speak, because they were crafting the bronze objects for the monarchy. And in many cases, when the monarchs were buried, they were buried with those bronze objects that were very extravagant, and they were becoming more and more sophisticated. The poor, the peasantry, remained using stone-based tools. Bronze was once again a sign of status only for the upper class, whereas the poor continue pretty much using their stone-based weapons. Bronze was used for ritual purposes, to craft figurines, for example, for gods and so on. Weapons, again, we see warriors using weapons made from bronze, and also, like I said, burial deposits. Those are, again, just typical objects that have been found during the Shang era. Again, in many cases, they were buried, again, the rulers, with those artifacts as a sign of status. Okay. Now, at some point, there will be nomadic invasions. There will be other groups that are going to be raiding the Shang dynasty, and this is going to lead to the fall of the Shang. And again, this new group of people will be the Zhou, as they're called, the Zhou dynasty or the Zhou dynasty, were actually a group of nomads that entered the region and overthrew the Shang dynasty and installed themselves as the new rulers of the Middle Kingdom. Now, we have, of course, run out of time. This is all I have for you. When we come back, we will continue looking at the formative stage. We will look at the Zhou dynasty. That was the longest dynasty, spanned for 8 centuries, give and take. And we're going to be looking also at the warring period, the warring states period. It was a tumultuous time of Chinese history when China was at war, different kingdoms. And we see the introduction of the classical works, what we mentioned, the 3 ways of thought: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. And hopefully in session 2, we'll be moving into also part 3, the emergence of the Chinese Empire. Okay, so this is all I have for you. I'll see you then in session 2. Thank you.